unlike the others. I never held blame for my mother due to her mental illness. Not until I realized that her mental illness was an umbrella term for a plethora of unhealthy narcissistic coping skills created to mask her own resentment for being a parent. I say this with much fragility and embarrassment due to the distance apples fall from their trees, and my own recurring resentment of being a parent at times. Ironically, my compassion for her waned when I became a parent myself and finally had a more full awareness of what she had gone through and how much more she could have worked on behalf of her own happiness, if no one else's. Bipolar is a tricky disease and diagnosis. The way it manifested in my mother was with radical mood swings, laughing maniacally one minute and chasing one of the others around whilst brandishing a frying pan, dustpan, or house shoe the next. She would never find me reading on the toilet or sitting in the closet listening to records, as I was prone to do. She was childlike, fragile, and neurotic. She took to sleeping all day, citing that it was the side effects of her medication, only to be brought home in the middle of the night by a police officer claiming that she was found screaming in the city streets 6 miles away. The car was still parked in the darkened driveway, indicating that she had walked the entire way. When asked why she was out on the town at such a dreadful hour and by foot no less, she would look at me dumbly and simply say that she had wanted to go for a walk. It was that simple. No mention of her extraordinarily loud conversation with the Cosmos on the street corner. I did not dare ask her out of fear of her, and that the shame and humiliation would cause her to further unravel. She used the same matter-of-fact flatness of tone to rationalize all of her absurd behavior. I don't like the sound it makes, she would say after cutting the power to the house, breaking a lamp, or cutting the power cords to the fridge freezer and or the microwave. I still do not fully understand whether or not my acceptance of her answer was due to her being in an irrefutable position of authority, despite her childish behavior, or the fact that even as a child, the impulse to quiet the soul-siphoning siren song of modernity made absolute sense to me. I never knew what to do with my mother's apathy and indifference toward us, especially now in hindsight with the knowledge that some of the most glorious moments in my childhood were as a direct result of her dismissal and rejection of us. When our choir of voices began to crescendo and our boisterous bodies bounced off the walls, my mother would stir from her slumber and storm the house, tossing children out of the house earlobe by earlobe before reinforcing our expulsion with the click of the door lock. Whatever sibling squabbles were interrupted by Mom's awakened wrath were immediately squashed, diffused as it was into the vast expansion of the outdoors. We would pound on the door, attempting to appeal to her with promises of a quieter climate, definitely a cooler one for us, since the North Carolina summers were biblically hot, before setting off to explore the woods or the semi-formed foundations in the developing housing lots neighboring our own. We would chatter excitedly about all the possible future friends we would have once the neighborhood was full, thereby outing ourselves about what was lacking in our relationship with each other. If we were able to, we would pack a quick snack consisting of sleeves of saltine crackers and tins of Vienna sausages before being exiled from the house. Otherwise, we would return home between 12 to 2 p.m. to find snacks on the front porch, but with the door still unsympathetically locked. Whether voluntarily or involuntarily excommunicated from the home environment, the contract was to be home no later than the illumination of the street lights. If not, my mother would compound the confusion as to our worth or importance to her by spanking us for our defiance and disobedience in this regard. The range of dysfunctional attachment disorders that I could pull from at any given moment is impressively alienating, even to oneself. For all of my mom's eccentricities, she was a fighter. She fought against my dad's patriarchal and controlling rule read, wisdom and discernment equals tyranny in the name of love. She fought against the demands of motherhood and the needs of her children. She fought against societal norms and civility. She fought against herself and her own passions and interests in willful defiance to even herself. In doing so, she fueled the other fights, oscillating between self-sabotage, self-pity, and self-righteousness. Torrid triangulation between various identities and never finding balance between service to others and service to self. Stuck in a cycle, and at the mercy of her circumstance, which never seemed to allow her to fully blossom into the woman she was always meant to be, but also was so crushingly overwhelming as to not allow her to fully deal with the day to day maintenance of her ongoing life choices. A cautionary tale, I remind myself here. Persistently fighting the futility of one's own existence is indeed exhausting. Depression is inevitable. When things oscillated too uncontrollably or violently from one extreme to another, or were continuously destructive, my father would spend most of his downtime splicing together cords from various circumcised electrical devices with an angered Iswaney, no doubt at what he perceived to be deliberate sabotage to his happiness. It was an indication that Mom needed a break. By then we all did. The topmost floor of UNC's psychiatric hospital was the floor for the wayward and willful, an arena of adult babies in various states of arrested development due to misattunements, maladaptations, and failed attachments stemming from childhood and all the trauma that lies therein. It was so incredibly odd to visit my mom there. On the elevator up, one could feel an energetic shift in the air. It is no wonder that historically, mood disorders were treated with exorcisms. Any parameter, like the PKE machine in Ghostbusters, would be off the charts. There were other forces at work when these energies came together. Like a haunting or possession, it was chaotic. I would exaggerate if I said that it was exactly like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or a scene from 12 Monkeys, but it would only be a slight exaggeration. The doors of the elevator would open to traffic. Patients anxiously queued at the elevator door, waiting to go down for a much anticipated cigarette, making it awkward for us to exit, which we would do straight into other patients' gowned bodies dancing away from any attempt by the nurses to subdue or steer activity in a desired direction. It seemed no calmer than our own home. Worse even. But maybe there was solace for my mom, finally being with her soul tribe, or whichever souls were invading and inhabiting their bodies. I never saw my mom mingling outside her room. Instead, her door would always be open or slightly ajar in welcome of any visitor of the ward, unlike the firmly shut door of her bedroom at home. She would be in an unflattering grandmotherly caftan, or in a pair of my dad's boxers worn as shorts and an oversized shirt of his, as was her home attire. She would welcome us with a tentative and sheepish smile, as if shy of our audience of her on that particular stage. In speaking to her, you would think there was a mix-up. I had never seen nor heard her behave more soundly in my life. As if in defiance of her own illness, of us, of the doctors, the other patients, and bipolar diagnosis. Was it situational? Was it some sordid game of gaslighting wherein her willingness to perfectly behave in that space indicated that the issue was the environment inside the home, not inherent inside of her? What about the less than hospitable hospital environment? Was it just in juxtaposition to the more histrionic theatrical performance of mental illness of the other patients? Of course, the phrase all of the above solidly applies here. I have come to realize this as fact during my own healing work, in which I am forced to examine my own transgressions and triggers, environmental, emotional, and otherwise, and as the journey led me to pursue higher education in the study of psychology and psychopathy. One of my mother's most confounding transgressions was her very non-habitual smoking. One would never suspect it. You could never smell cigarettes on her, and you could never find them on her person, nor anywhere in the house. It was in fact so bizarre that my brain simply would not allow me to accept it. Where was she getting these stinky sticks? Sometime in elementary school, long before after-school extracurriculars became a part of my normal routine, my younger brother and I walked the quarter of a mile down the road from the bus stop and up the 50-plus yards of perfectly straight driveway toward the house, eyeing my mother the entire way. She was sitting on the side of the house on a cinder block, smoking a cigarette in plain view. It was only when we were close enough to clearly see what she was doing that she put it out unhurriedly. More acting out, more defiance. I would plead with her to stop and fell right into her trap. From then on, I would periodically catch her smoking. I never knew if the cat was simply out of the bag, or if my pleas to her to stop smoking gave her some validation as to her value in our lives. The fact that she never smelled like smoke otherwise and had a keen sense of smell in those days indicated that she purposefully waited until the bus dropped off to sneak outside to smoke in plain view of her children. Weirdly, at age 10, I started having dreams of smoking, which were pre orgasmic and extremely satisfying, though I myself had yet to smoke a cigarette or have an orgasm. I decided then that she must have smoked when pregnant with me, an accusation that she vehemently denied. Still, I am skeptical and will simply add that to the list of vices I can blame on her poor parentage, unironically. She did a lot with this non habitual vice, however. I think those pleas from me for her to stop really did become internalized to the point of crystallization as some form of personal value. On my last visit to the psych ward to see my mother, and I think her last admittance, we entered her room, and she was alight with excitement. She explained how the screened in activity porch, containing only a card table and a ping pong table, was underutilized, and how there were more smokers than card sharks. So she single handedly drew up a petition and had all the patients sign it, and even a few nurses, to turn that room into a smoker's lounge. What this meant was that, instead of waiting agitatedly for permission and a nurse escort to take the elevator 70 plus floors down to the building's entrance to smoke with dereliction on the grass away from the doors, all those wanting to smoke would then be able to smoke on their living floor, not to mention alleviating the strain of short-staffed nurses, as all were needed on the dance floor to waltz the patients into order. This screened-in activity area was now a designated smoking area. My mother named it the Smorch, which stood for smoking porch. We are always told to pick your battles, but my mother had no battles. She engaged in her own crusades, mostly of the completely irrational. It continues to this day as she battles homelessness, despite still owning that same childhood home. Maybe there is something hallowed about those halls now that no longer carry laughter or conversation. Walls in which you could still faintly see the dark stains of small handprints, despite the layers of newer paint. Maybe in her mind's eye, it is not a home. Her home, unless we are all suffering or smiling stuffed like sardines inside, or pitilessly locked out of it. For all her many volatile emotional states, my mother did not cry often. Not even the day of my father's funeral. By 8 a.m., myself, the others, and a few cousins were sitting on the couch with bated breath, waiting for my mother to exit her room to see what psychological state she would be in after losing her partner of 45 years, knowing our own was hanging by threadbare fragility. We were all unquestionably willing to hold each other up, down, or any other direction as needed. But more importantly, we were all dutifully together to do that for Mom. We were anxious, not knowing how that would look, and never in a million years would guess what was to come. She emerged almost cheerily, appropriately dressed, all in black and without ostentation or distraction. She breezed past the parade of pre-funeral procession pitiful looks and right out the front door, leaving it wide open. My younger brother followed hurriedly behind her, shouting over his shoulder that they were going to the store, and then shut the door on any debate. We were aghast. What would she be wanting at 8 a.m.? And why not just send one of us to fetch it? When they returned, my mother was again in the lead, chin up, head held high, with my brother in tow, wheeling a cooler. I bought some beers, was all she said. I did not think twice as to any possible impropriety, and was back on the couch with a beer in hand before I even knew I had moved. Call it teleportation, call it disassociation, call it eagerness to numb the pain, or more probably poor coping skills, as I drank a lot in those days. Whatever it was, the cool of the can brought relief to my hands, which had been clenching so tightly together to keep from trembling. Looking down, I realized that it was a Bud Light Lime. Curiouser and curiouser. I mentioned previously that my dad was not a big drinker. He was not big into anything unseemly, vice-oriented, or indecorous. He allowed no secular music in the house, save the records from the thrift store I bought that went unnoticed either because I myself did, or because I would cleverly position a classical one on top. I would sometimes even call attention to a classical album so as to distract from the secular albums. Similarly, my father never allowed alcohol in the house, and it goes without saying he never allowed any drugs. Never. He even eschewed any pharmaceutical, preferring home remedies instead. We celebrated with sparkling cider, ginger ale, or better and cheaper water. He did have a stint making his own root beer, but gave that up because it made everyone entirely too happy. I think he suspected his recipe to be a Trojan horse which would ride us away from God and into the land of crack and heroin. Oh, Dad, I can assure you, it was not your root beer that was to blame for the cracked and rocky streets I was to ride on once or twice in my time. I won't speak about that here and now, and I cannot speak for any of the others. But for my mom, she never indulged anything that I could recall, although my dad would recount their first meeting and seeing her as a sort of ethereal vision before having that illusion shattered by her bringing a joint to her lips. He never finished the story, but all 7 of his children inferred quite easily that he clearly was not deterred by that. I can count the 3 or 4 times that my mom bought a singular Corona beer, which she never drank, but would place in the very back of the refrigerator, simply to antagonize my father. It was one of her cat and mouse games designed to anger him. When he finally did see the beige neck of the bottle emerge some days or months later behind the rows of aging food, slowly being eaten or thrown out, it would enrage him not knowing how long it had been there. This was an indication of how little control he actually had over his domain. And my mother. There was no distinction to him of ownership, and he would frequently say, "As long as you are living under Memwai roof, you will do as I say," and yada yada yada. I assume that Mom did not take kindly to ownership and control where there should have been love and cooperation. And it took my dad being on his deathbed for him to acknowledge that. And he did so only to me, stating in a low, raspy breath, "You know, I made your mother sick." To which I simply said, "I know." I knew in those days that he himself understood how little time he had left in this earthly realm, and that whatever he said, he was saying in full. So I knew the myriad of meanings of that statement, and even now dissect memorable scenes of toxicity between them looking for signs of his provocation to her madness. They are definitely there, though not the sole cause. My dad divulged a good many secrets to me during his darkest hours, and I am still unsure how he would feel about me sharing those. My intention is to validate his life and this storytelling in a way that honors all involved, their intentions at least, even if I cannot exactly vindicate their actions. I truly want to believe that everyone is doing the best that they can with what tools they have and have been taught to use. And so, this comes late in the writing. But I ask any reader mentioned or alluded to in this work to forgive my need to heal in this way. But I also urge you to stay in your lane. You, too, may agonize over your own pain in whichever way you choose until it bleeds AIDS out of you. The work of the wounded, like a soldier slowly bleeding out on the battlefield of life in hopes that their loyalty and devotion to the cause secures them salvation at the end of that exsanguination. I will have my glory here by any means necessary, and my higher and future healed selves thank me for my service. I hope my ancestors will too.